Good morning and good afternoon. My name is Makiko Yashiro, and I'm with the UN Environment Program Regional Office for Asia and the Pacific. And today I'm moderating this meeting with my colleague Han. And it's our pleasure to welcome you all to this regional briefing for Asia on the status of negotiations on the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework and preparation for the fourth open-ended working group on the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. And this briefing session is co-organized by UNEP, including UNEP World Conservation Monitoring Center, and supported by the Secretariat of the Convention on Biological Diversity. And our sincere thanks to Ms. Jyoti Masu Philip, Director of the Implementation and Support Division of the CBD Secretariat, for joining us today, despite a very difficult time difference. And I understand that it is 3 o'clock in Montreal in the morning, very early morning. So thank you very much, Jyoti, for joining us today. And we are also very pleased to welcome Mr. Francis Agbor, co-chair of the Post-2020 Open-Ended Working Group, as well as Mr. Vinod Masu, co-lead of the Contact Group on Open-Ended Working Group, and the chairperson of the National Biodiversity Authority of India, to the meeting. And our sincere appreciation also to Mr. Lu Ning, who serves as the Deputy Director General level, Department of Nature Ecology Conservation, Ministry of Ecology and Environment of China, for joining us today and to share his remarks. And we are very pleased to see a large number of participants who have joined us today, and many are from government agencies, but also from NGOs, academic institutions, private sector, as well as international organizations based in Asia. So very warm welcome to all of you. And as we all appreciate, the development of the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework has been a complex and challenging process, and especially because of the challenges due to COVID-19 pandemics. But as we prepare for the fourth open-ended working group to be held in Nairobi later this month, we very much hope that today's session will provide you with an overview of the status of negotiations, including updates on the intersessional work, as well as the expectations for the Nairobi meeting. So now, before we proceed, I would like to make a few housekeeping announcements. During the session, we'd like to request you to kindly mute your microphones. And after the presentations, we will have some time for Q&A. So if you have any questions, please kindly send them through the chat box. And please indicate your name and affiliation, and indicate which presenter your question is addressed to. And we'll be monitoring the questions shared through the chat box, and we'll invite our speakers to respond during the Q&A session. And for those of you who have not yet registered through the online page, please kindly register through the link that is being shared on the chat box. And please also note that presentation materials will be shared with you after the meeting. So with this, I'd like to proceed with the opening session. And first, I'd like to invite Ms. Dechen Sering, Regional Director and Representative for Asia and the Pacific, UN Environment Program, to deliver her welcome remarks.
Thank you very much, Makiko. Your Excellencies, distinguished delegates, ladies and gentlemen, on behalf of UNEP, it is a pleasure to welcome you to this virtual regional briefing for Asia on the status of negotiations on the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework and in preparation for the fourth open-ended working group meeting that will be held in Nairobi later this month. I want to express my sincere appreciation to Mr. Francis Ogbol to join us today and to share his perspective as co-chair of the open-ended working group. I would also like to thank Mr. Vinod Mathur, co-lead of the contact group on the open-ended working group for the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework and as chairperson of the National Biodiversity Authority of India. I'm also very pleased to welcome Mr. Liu Ning, negotiator for the CBD COP15 and representative of the Ministry of Ecology and Environment of the Government of China, as well as the presidency and host for the CBD COP15. I welcome your contribution to the meeting today, sir. My sincere thanks to Ms. Jyoti Mathur Philippe, Director of Implementation and Support Division of the CBD Secretariat, for her support and for joining us at this very early hour in Montreal. I would also like to extend my sincere thanks for the support from the UNEP Law Division provided under the third phase of the Africa, Caribbean, Pacific Multilateral Environmental Agreements project funded by the European Union as well as by the UNEP World Conservation Monitoring Center in organizing today's meeting. This is the second time such a meeting has been organized by UNEP for the region, and I'm grateful to my colleague, Mr. Balakrishna Pisupati, Program Manager, ACP MEA's 3 program, for his support in organizing these sessions. You will note we're also organizing similar sessions for other regions such as the Caribbean, Africa, and Latin America. The successful finalization and adoption of the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework is going to be crucial to lay the foundation for sustaining life on our planet. Major published scientific assessment reports have all highlighted that we're losing species at an unprecedented rate. Terrestrial, coastal, marine ecosystems are being severely degraded, and the implications are becoming clearer and clearer and more severe year by year. In the Asia Pacific region, when we look at our progress in achieving the Sustainable Development Goals, we're not on track to reach any of the environmental SDGs. And in fact, we're regressing on life on land, life underwater, on climate action. So this becomes critical not only for the global community, but for our region. Building on the outcomes of part 1 of COP15, as well as outcomes of the meetings that were held in Geneva in March this year, as Makiko mentioned, there's still a lot of intersessional work to be done between now and part 2 of the COP later this year. If we have an actionable and ambitious post 2020 global biodiversity framework to be successfully adopted by parties, it's going to be essential that we make substantive progress. And I look forward to this progress being made at the upcoming 4th Open Ended Working Group meeting in Nairobi later this month. The regional briefing meeting, we hope, will be a useful opportunities for countries in Asia to be briefed on key outcomes of the Geneva Biodiversity Conference, intersessional work, as well as preparations for upcoming negotiations. But we also look forward to hearing from you. We will also hear from panelists today on these aspects in detail. UNEP continues to support efforts of parties to the biodiversity-related conventions in the ongoing process for developing the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework, and today's briefing session is a part of this effort. I hope that the discussions during this meeting will provide a useful basis for your further negotiations in the development of the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework, and as I mentioned in the forthcoming open-ended working group meeting. I want to thank you for the opportunity to deliver these welcome remarks, and I really look forward to your active participation in this meeting and to take forward this very important work ahead of you. I thank you.
Thank you very much, Dechen, for your welcome remarks, providing the overall context and setting the scene for today's meeting. So now we like to move to the first session, which focuses on the updates on the negotiations on the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework and preparation for the 4th open-ended working group on the framework. And in this session, we will have 4 presentations to be followed by the Q&A. So as I mentioned earlier, if you have any questions, please send them through the chat box. So now it's my pleasure to invite Mr. Francis Aguilar, the co-chair for the post-2020 open-ended working group, to provide updates on the negotiations on the framework, including the roadmap for the finalization of the framework. So please, Francis, over to you.
Thank you, moderator. I don't know, can my slides be shown from that side?
Okay, yes, we could certainly do so. Ariom, may I kindly request you to project? Perfect, thank
Yes.
you.
Yeah, so I'll try to give you, first of all, an overall view of the GBF itself, and then we'll see what happened in the meeting we had in Geneva, and then we sum it up with what is coming up in Nairobi. As I had, what are the expectations? How are we trying to organize it? So if we could go to the next slide, please. Now, this slide basically tells you that everything is going wrong. If you look at the ecosystem status, you look at the species status, you look at biomass and others, everything there is not working well. And mainly is a result of those drivers, which are both indirect and direct, acting on those different aspects of biodiversity and leading us to the situation we see today. So the situation is not good, and this is why we are very much talking about the post-2020. Go to the next slide. Now, that next slide, you can see from there that there was a hope, of course, that as we get to 2020, we could begin somehow, after again witnessing a slight continuous loss, that thick line, that we could begin to bend this curve upwards. But as we all know now, we are in 2022. And perhaps where you see 2020, it will now be adjusted to 2022 because the situation is not that good. So instead, we are likely to be on the dotted line. And therefore meaning that even bending the curve for biodiversity loss as the delay in this framework continues to unfold, this is becoming a real challenge, and therefore biodiversity loss is bound to continue. So by 2030, shall we have reached where we say now, we have just reached that point where there is no loss, there is no gain, what you call the no net loss aspect, or is it now going to be beyond even 2030? And so this is the challenge we have realistically before us. If you go to the next slide, please. So therefore, although things are very bad as we see it, there's always hope, even when situations are very bad. And this is where the framework itself brings that belief that things can still change if we put our heads together, if we put our efforts together, but we cannot do that without a guiding kind of document or a framework that should enable everybody to take action. So this is then what we did with the framework, that we were guided by COP decision 1434, that we look at those 14 overarching principles. And we have really observed that as we develop this, but also that this framework is a framework for all. There is nobody in this world who doesn't depend on biodiversity. So when you're talking about biodiversity, you're talking every human being, whether you're talking of government, private sector, academia, NGOs, IPLCs, everyone is on board. Next slide, please. So basically, I will not take a lot of time on this, but I'll tell you that the current draft one, when you look at it, those are the 11 sections that you see in that document. So it has got the background about the GBF purpose, relationship with the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, theory of change. The 2050 vision, as most of you know, is already agreed, is not being negotiated. But we have, of course, the 2030 mission of the framework that is yet to be negotiated. You have the goals and the milestone. I'll touch on milestones, the action targets. Then those other sections, H to K, that deals with implementation support, enabling conditions, responsibility reporting, and then outreach and awareness. So basically that is currently how it is, but it could still change. Next slide. So if you look at the framework, I talked about the theory of change in that section D of the framework. So in the theory of change, without having to explain a lot more into detail, it's basically now telling you what the indirect and direct drivers are doing and what the consequences are in that black box you see there. And we are saying that there's opportunity to really come up with actions that could help us get to the 2050 goals. And therefore, we have those targets you see in the middle there. The one which is concerns reducing threats, the one which is concerned with meeting needs of people, and then the tools and solutions. But above all that, you need to have, of course, those implementation guiding principles. You are talking about the values of IPLCs, but also importantly, responsibility and reporting, planning review, and then the mission statement I was talking about. So we believe that if we can really agree on these targets, and which is the focus now going to COP, then we could begin seeing that the 2050 goals, which deals with ecosystems and species diversity, human needs, meeting them sustainably, benefits from biodiversity shared equitably, and means of implementation. So that could deliver us then into the 2050 vision of living in harmony with nature. Can I explain this at the next slide? So where are we in the process itself? If you look at since COP 14, since COP decision 1434, that is 2018, really we've moved a lot, a long distance, a long journey it has been. We had the regional consultations immediately after that, from January up to around May. We also had thematic consultations, as you see them there, ABS, habitat restoration, marine, coastal issues, resource mobilization, capacity building, all that eventually led us to having the first meeting of the working group in August 2019. From there, we moved on and we prepared the zero draft, which zero draft was presented in the second meeting of the working group in February 2020. Again, basing on a number of thematic consultations that took place, and as you go towards 2021, we also had a number of informal sessions of SAPSA and SBI. We managed then, taking on board all that had come from there, to prepare draft one of the framework. And then this draft one, we presented it virtually in August, September last year. And then eventually we took the same document to the physical meeting, the resumed physical meeting of the working group, the second part of the third meeting. And now we are heading to Nairobi. So after Nairobi, then we should go to COP. So let's go to the next slide. So in the next slide, you're going basically to see, next slide, please. You're going to see what happened at in Geneva. Do we go to the next slide? It seems the screen is frozen that side.
Sorry, I'm at lessons learned. Don't you see lessons learned at the moment?
It's still showing formal process. So maybe there is some.
Sorry, then I will try to do it again. Is it now showing?
No, go back a bit. Previous.
This one?
Yeah, there. So basically to summarize for you that we made progress in the resumed physical meeting of the working group. And I'll start from the right going towards the left. So the first column there, full first cycle of negotiation, all that is listed there, those targets, those goals, sections E, those ones we are able to go through them while we were in Geneva. And so you'll see there's text on those, the outcome of Geneva. Then partially negotiated, we didn't complete them. Again, they are listed in the next column there. Target 7, target 8, 13, 20, 21, 22. And then you have the milestone which I'm going to tackle, and also the issue of the time frame. When do we end it at 2030? Please go back a little. And then the other section not negotiated at all are the ones you see there. A, B, C, D, H, I, J, K. And then the COP decision. So that is where things, because of time, we didn't touch it at all. But to go back a little bit on the right-hand side, from Geneva, please note that target 19, which was on resource mobilization, has now been proposed to be split into two. So you'll see 19.1, that is on resources, financial, and then 19.2 on capacity building. Those were merged at one point, but again, we had ideas that we should separate them, and that is what happened there. Next slide. So what did we learn? That we could actually have done perhaps much more if there was enough time, but perhaps we didn't have enough time. And then because of parties meeting for the first time again, they tended to bring a lot of text, a lot of suggestions in these targets, and some of them are duplicated. So would we be able to look at that where there's some duplications? Now, BBs was proposed to be there, and we are saying that if we handle it early, it could facilitate discussion on goals and targets. And then where there was no negotiation at all, those ones I listed, then the first draft of the framework remains the document to be used, but also we should consult the following. One is that there are a number of suggestions and good ideas from the co-leads observation and reflection in the document you see there, and then the co-chair's reflection. So as we proceed with the discussion, we need to take note of that, but also that we could be considering indicators as we negotiate the goals and targets. That could be helpful. Let's go to the next slide. But as we go to the next slide, we realize that we need to balance the workloads. Now in Nairobi, what is it our expectation? Next slide. One is that this is going to be now based on the text that came from Geneva. It is a text-based negotiation, or as I said earlier, where we didn't negotiate, we revert back to draft one, and of course the co-chair's reflection and those other ones being gathered also by what the colleagues have come up with. And then we should be working towards compromise. Parties are not generally yet in that mood, and we don't know why. They're tending to put a lot of text together, which complicates the discussion. Then we hopefully should have a clean text. But if it were possible, we shouldn't be having square brackets. Then resolving differences and narrowing the composite text, which has come from Geneva. You know, you look at that document, you will see really that it is complex in its own right, and people need to narrow it down. And we have seen that where they narrow it down and reduce the text, it facilitates discussion. And we're also saying that we should refrain from adding new text on what was already discussed, those ones you saw, which we said. So anytime parties again will start adding their new text, that means people have to rethink afresh. So rather we should aim at narrowing those ones now. And then when it comes to DSI and milestones, you are going to talk about this later on, but the idea is now, where do we place them as we go ahead? Let's go to the next slide. So next slide is on milestones, and this milestone was discussed in the resumed meeting of the working group in Geneva, but there was this agreement that we do not have to have a section that is specifically dedicated to milestones. Parties again have come up with a different view this time. First time in Rome, they told us we need milestones. Now there is this view that actually we could have these milestones put either under goals or targets. And so that is what is going to happen in Nairobi. We hope that the discussion which are going on, if not concluded, then we are going to set up friends of the co-chairs to help us really agree on where to place the milestones, under which goals or on which targets. And it is not, that contact group is not going to discuss those elements of the milestone, just to say this milestone, this goes to this goal, this or to this target, that, period. So that in the follow-up discussion in the contact group then begins discussing the goals or the target, aware of the addition or the element of the milestone that has been brought there. Let's go to the next slide. The next slide is on DSI. Just like we also talked about the milestone, this is similar. And first of all, we have to say that generally on DSI, a lot of progress was made in the meeting we had in Geneva. And definitely, I must say that it was almost beyond our expectations as well. So in Nairobi, we are going to receive an update on the progress on the intersectional work that has taken place on DSI. And then that meeting will be used for us to discuss more on the COP15 decision on DSI. and especially the document that came up, you'll see that there's a lot of square brackets on that. And then we also want parties to agree where to put DSI in the framework. Where do they want it to be placed? Let's go to the next slide. So this is about the Nairobi meeting itself. So the sessions will be, and I've been touching on some of them already. We start with those that were not negotiated at all. You know them now. Then those that were partially negotiated. And from that, we should go to the full round of discussion. Friends of the colleagues will be established as necessary. Parallel contact group starts on day 2, that is on 22nd June. And we want to keep the evening session as much as possible to friends of the co-chairs or colleagues. And we are going to have very limited these sessions during the lunch break. We want to have as few as possible. Let's go to the next slide. So this is the overall plan for Nairobi as I come towards the end of the presentation, is that we are going to start the preliminary meetings from 16th to 20th June, where on 16th we are having coordination meeting with the colleagues. We need to, as much as possible, understand each other on how we are going to conduct business in Nairobi and how to handle the issues before us. Then the workshop on planning and monitoring and review will be on 17th and 18th. 19th is where we have a bureau meeting and other meetings that might be communicated. Then regional meetings will take place on June 20th. Then we begin proper the fourth meeting of the working group on June 21st. And that is when in the morning we have the plenary, followed by in the afternoon we have contact group 6, which will be looking at section H2K, then contact group 6, which will be looking at again sections A to D. I'll be explaining contact group 6 later, but also BBs. Then, as I explained earlier, you can see what starts on 22nd as parallel group discussions. And in the interest of time, you can always look at that. They are not difficult to understand. On 24th, that is a Friday, then we shall have a plenary looking at the stock take. We will also look at the COP decision. Where are we with the stock take? How far are we going with the work? And then we continue on 25th with what needs to be discussed. And 26th we close, if possible, with the one plenary. If not, then we're going to have a series of them. Depends on what will happen there. Next slide. So the next slide now basically gives you the contact groups I was talking about. Most of you know some of these contact groups already, but what we then discussed after the meeting in Geneva, we found that there were some groups that were definitely overloaded and they were not able to proceed with discussing those other relevant sections of the framework. So this time around, we said, let us have sections A to E and H to K being handled by a specific contact group. And so you see their names there. This is Dalwa from Dasto from Tajikistan, and then Mary May from Seychelles. So for them, they will be on those sections so that those co-leads can focus their attention on goals, on targets 1 to 8, targets 9 to 13, targets 14 to 21, and then on DSI. That is the thinking going forward. Next slide, and that will be the last bit of it. So basically, those are the meeting documents. You can visit the web page or the link there as you see them, read them, familiarize yourself with them before the meeting so that we can move a little faster during the meeting. Thank you so much. I hope I didn't take so much time.
Thank you very much, Francis, for your presentation and sharing with us a very helpful overview of where we stand in terms of our negotiations on the framework, and also the roadmap and the expectations for the meeting in Nairobi. Hopefully, you could kindly stay with us a bit more so that you could join us for the Q&A session. So now it's my pleasure to invite Ms. Jyoti Mathur-Philip, Director of the Implementation and Support Division of the CBD Secretariat, to provide additional updates on the outcomes of the meetings in Geneva and the expectations for the meeting in Nairobi. Jyoti, over to you.
Thank you so much. Can you see my presentation or?
I think if you could put it on the presentation mode.
Yes, that's what I will do now.
Thank you.
Okay, so thank you very much for inviting us, the Secretariat of the Convention on Biological Diversity, to this meeting. As you can understand, this is very important for us, and so I was willing to get up at 3 o'clock and participate in this, but I see that this is a very valuable briefing, as it's got very high interest. So just let me give you a little bit of a background on where we stand with our subsidiary bodies, so that, you know, because the subsidiary bodies will actually feed into the open-ended working group, because that is how the parties at COP14 decided that, you know, SABSA and SBI also had a role in the working group, and also beyond the working group as we come to implementation, because you know, it's not just the framework we're talking about, but also how it's implemented. So we are trying to the parties wanted to take a package approach to this to the GBF, and part of that included deciding on deciding on indicators and you know, providing advice on a monitoring framework that will be that will be adopted at the same time as the GBF, as well as some other decisions related to what the work of the SBI, like an enhanced review mechanism, etc. So I thought we could give you a bit of an overview of what happened with SABSTA and SBI also. So if you may recall, last year at this time, we were actually meeting virtually for SABSTA and SBI. We started from 3rd of May, and I think we ended 16th of June. It was a 6-week meeting, and we had SABSTA and SBI going on at the same time. We finally met in person, as Francis just told us, in March in Geneva, which was a part 2 of both the SABSTA and the SBI meetings, as well as for the working group. For SABSTA, we had about 1,900 registered participants, of which almost 1,400 were present in person in Geneva. And the reason that we are highlighting this number is because we've never had these kind of numbers. We've always had like 400 or 500 people come to SABSTA, but now all of a sudden we're seeing that numbers are really jumping high, which just goes to show how interested people are, and parties and CSOs, in joining us, and you know, the importance of the global biodiversity framework. So we had 151 parties. Again, this was a record number, and we were very happy that such a huge number joined. We had more than 300 CSOs and other stakeholders. Again, it shows that we have a very robust interest in our work. So we had 7 plenary sessions and lots of contact groups. And for those who were there, you will have noticed that most of our detailed negotiations happened in the contact groups, so that there was much more dialogue and negotiation happening, and not just the formal plenary setting. The part 2 built on part 1, so we did not start again. So if you recall, we do things like first readings and then we go to CRPs or contact groups. That's not what we did. The first reading happened during part 1, and when we got to Geneva, we started with either contact groups or CRPs in most cases. And so, as I said, some agenda items were directly related to the post 2020 global biodiversity framework. So the input for the ended working group took place concurrently with the meeting of SubStar. Now, so we had 10 draft recommendations from SubStar. I will not go into all of them. However, I want to point out 24.2, which is the proposed monitoring framework for post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. As I just said, that we have, the parties had decided at Sharm el-Sheikh that we will go with the package and that these things will not come later as they did with Aichi targets, but it's a lesson learned from Aichi that, we will have a lot of the decisions already adopted at COP15 Part 2 so that we are able to then hit the ground running with the GBF. Some facts and figures for SPI. Again, we met virtually in May last year. Now we met again in Geneva, same thing. We had 7 plenary sessions and lots of contact groups. Part 2 built on Part 1 of the informal sessions that took place in February 2021. And then finally, there were many more agenda items, and I will go through them, that are related to post-2020. So we had 19 draft decisions from SBI, and some of them, as I said, are related directly to the implementation of the framework. So if we have recommendation 3.3, which is the Gender Plan of Action for Post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. Some of you may recall this came about 6 years later for Aichi targets. So now, again, we want to do this early. 3.4 is the implementation plan and the capacity plan for Cartagena Protocol. So even though it's a protocol, it still is part of the convention and therefore related to the implementation of the post-2020. We had 3.5, which was communications for post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework and its implementation. 3.6, which is very important. It was the resource mobilization strategy. And 3.7, the financial mechanism, which is the Global Environment Facility at the moment, which is very, very important for the implementation of the framework. Then we had a decision on capacity building and development, technical and scientific cooperation and technology transfer. And I think we're missing one here, which is on the enhanced review mechanism. So I will have to add that in. And so some draft recommendations are bracketed still. In fact, we have a lot of brackets, but this is normal. And I think that we will resolve all of them as we come closer to, as we get to COP and decide and adopt decisions there. Here are more. You will get this. You will get this slide. So I'm not going to go through this, but we have knowledge management and clearinghouse. We have options. That's the one that I wanted to point out. Options to enhance planning, reporting, and review mechanisms, so that we strengthen the implementation of the convention and all the others. And I will leave that here. There is, of course, intersessional work going on, and on resource mobilization, the review mechanism, and on science and technology transfer. The monitoring framework, which is part of SubSA, but it's also something that's ongoing. And some of you may have joined the resource mobilization webinar that took place yesterday for parties, a conversation amongst parties on the way forward. And some of you might have submitted some of your views for the peer review that took place under the review mechanism. And some of you might be attending the workshop on review mechanism that is going to take place later this month at the margins, actually next week at the margins of the next open-ended working group. So some facts and figures, we met virtually from 23rd August. So now we get to the working group, which Francis has already talked about. So I will just quickly go through it. We met virtually last year, if you recall. Then we met in Geneva earlier this year, which was held concurrently with SAPSA 24 and SPI 3. Very, very complicated, but we got through it. We had more than 1,900 registered participants for part 2, almost 1,400 in person. So it was a very large meeting. We had 151 parties and more than 300 CSOs. We had 10 plenary sessions, both parts 1 and 2, and these were interspersed with contact groups for more detailed negotiation for both the first draft of the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework as well as the agenda item on DSI. The outcomes and Francis has already alluded to these. We had 3 recommendations that were adopted. One was on the Global Biodiversity Framework, another one was on digital sequence information, and the third one was on the preparation of this upcoming 4th meeting. The full text of these recommendations is contained in our meeting report, and that is, and you will find it on our website, plus the 4th meeting. As an outcome of the working group 3 was that we will have a 4th meeting of the working group, which, as you know now, is scheduled for later this month in Nairobi. So what are the expectations? And Francis has done a much better and longer job at this. Working group 4 will pick up where we left off in Geneva, wherever we left off. And if you recall Francis's first slide with all of these, where everything stands, where all the goals and targets and sections stand. So we will start off where we left off, both for agenda item 4, which is post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework, and agenda item 5, which is digital sequence information on genetic resources. The list of documents that Francis had shared with you are available on our meeting website, so you can go there at any time and access them. As of yesterday, we had 1,800 participants pre-registered for the meeting, of which 1,025 were for on-site participation and 775 for virtual participation from 125 parties and 217 observer organizations. If you have not registered as yet, we kindly ask you to do so now, so that you can participate in the meeting. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Jyoti, for your presentation and really providing a very comprehensive summary of the key outcomes from the Geneva conference and also expectations for the upcoming meeting in Nairobi. And you may have questions related to what have been presented by Francis and Jyoti. So please continue to send questions through the chat box. And in the meantime, I'd like to invite Mr. Balakrishna Pisupati, Program Manager of the UNEP Law Division, to provide additional details related to the key issues for discussion during the meeting in Nairobi. Bala, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you. Very good morning, good afternoon, colleagues. Great pleasure to see so many of old friends and colleagues, as well as new colleagues joining this particular briefing session. Allow me to start sharing my screen so that you'll be quickly able to, we can start looking at, just hold on.
Request Jyoti to unshare.
Yes, yeah.
First. Okay, great.
Is that done? Sorry about that, yes.
That's okay. Just hold on. Can you see the slides?
Yes, yes, we can.
Is it in
Presentation.
presentation mode?
Yeah.
Okay. Perfect. So thanks a lot. As I mentioned that was certainly two very brilliant overview presentations, both looking at the outcomes of the meeting in Geneva as well as preparing to be in Nairobi to have the final discussions for the Global Biodiversity Framework meeting starting in a few days' time. So my presentation will essentially look at some of the key elements based on the discussions and outcomes of the Geneva meeting in preparation for the fourth meeting of the working group, and draws upon the reflections document that the co-chairs have prepared using the outcomes of the meeting in Geneva. Good. So the chair's reflections document, I don't know, I'm sure many would have already have gone through that. So to recap some of the key elements as we prepare to convene in Nairobi, to look at some of the issues of dealing with the value of milestones, looking at the targets under the specific goals, concerns on implementation time frame, then focus on the all of society aspects and the relevant stakeholders, and further discussion on the principles of common but differentiated responsibility that may be best done also on the context of resource mobilization. When you're looking at the outcome, the reflections document that are going to be the first elements of the discussions in Nairobi, we actually are looking at some difficulty with the presentation here. Yes, so the 2050 vision, the text is pre-agreed, language adopted in decision 10/2. So certainly the suggestion or the reflection coming from the co-chairs indicate that the vision statement as it is presented in the draft of the Global Biodiversity Framework is something which parties have already agreed as early as COP10. So the suggestion is to keep the vision statement as such. Looking at the 2030 mission, the idea is that based on the inputs on the discussions that happened in Geneva, the suggestion is to be as concise, but more importantly, as communicable as possible, because one of the key elements of a successful implementation of realizing the objectives that all of us are working towards achieving the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework as we are progressing towards 2030 is to make it as communicable as possible to a number of stakeholders group who are to be a part of the process of implementation. Looking at the guidance for implementation at the working group, the parties suggested to focus on some elements that are reflected in the slide there on gender responsiveness, rights-based approaches, synergies among the conventions, different conceptualizations of nature and biodiversity values, and ensuring participation and inclusivity. So essentially, these are some of the very generic ideas and the issues that the parties have commented upon and have already provided their inputs in Geneva. So the new guidance that is contained in the reflections document is to look at alternate text proposed with specific paragraphs focusing on the above focal areas. Of course, the areas that are identified as a part of the discussion in Geneva are very, very important to essentially not just look at effective implementation of the framework, but also looking at mainstreaming some of these ideas across different elements of it. So the discussions on goal A at the working group 3 focused on some elements that you can see on the screen. The need to focus on the three components, the ecosystems, the species and the genetic diversity. And there is a requirement that parties focus on it. The rationale for numerical aspects of the goals. Should the numbers be a part of the targets? Because there are a number of discussions that happened in Geneva where opinions and comments were presented by people who actually provided inputs into the discussions in Geneva that looked at the need for having numbers as a part of the targets. And there definitely will be some discussion that will happen in Nairobi focusing on that. And also use of words such as integrity, healthy, and things like that as well. So the rationale, as it is explained in the reflections document, is to look at some of those numbers. For example, I'm just only, looking at the overarching element of the 15% area increase as it was suggested is a kind of a reminder to say that that 15% suggested is by 2050 and not by 2030. I'm just sort of trying to present a few key elements of some of those discussions that will be taken up for discussion in Nairobi. Reduce both the extinction rate and the extinction risk. So it's just not looking at the rate of extinction, but also they're looking at the risk of extinction, which actually was also a part of the discussion there. In terms of the reflections related to goal B, the suggestions that were made, again contained in the reflections document, is to replace the word nature's contributions are valued by the words ecosystem services are valued. Many of you probably are aware that the discussions that are happening in the context of the convention preference is to use the ecosystem services rather than the nature-based contributions as an important element to this. Goal C, the focus would be on should DSI be referred to in the goal, given the discussions related to DSI are still ongoing and incomplete. And there was a mention about this by Francis as well, as the discussions have really progressed in Geneva. There are still some elements of the discussions related to DSI and the global biodiversity framework that need to be elaborated and agreed upon by the parties. On goal D, the alternate text suggests building on the past investments and the resources are increased. But then there was also some questions raised during the discussions in Geneva that looked at what does means of implementation mean to parties. So we will have some presentation, some discussion on this in this particular meeting as well. And reflecting on the milestones, the focus would be more on whether the milestone, how do we deal with the milestones there? Because there were some discussions that looked at the suggestions to remove the milestones, but also the focus on mainstreaming the elements of milestones across the targets. And this was also something which Francis alluded to when he was making his remarks. Now, going to the targets, target 1, and what you see on the screen, those that are highlighted in bigger letters in red color are the additional text that are suggested in the reflections document based on the discussions in Geneva, where the target 1 looks at ensuring all land and sea areas are under integrated biodiversity, inclusive spatial planning, addressing land and sea use change, retaining the existing intact and wilderness areas. So essentially to look at all the areas, that was the important suggestion that was made. Target 2 is to elaborate on those words that are highlighted, looking at ensuring that at least 20% of the degraded land and sea areas are under restoration. This also ties with the UN Decade on Restoration and also is reflected by a number of other discussions and negotiations that are happening, ensuring connectivity among them and also focusing on priority ecosystems. On target 3, as you know, the target looks at ensuring 30% globally the land areas and sea areas, especially areas of particular importance for biodiversity, are protected and managed. But then there is an additionality that has been now discussed in Geneva, which will be a part of the discussion in Nairobi, that looks at the provision of ecosystem services to be integrated or to be added into this target, so that the interests and the priorities and the objectives of the convention are appropriately captured in this particular target. Looking at target 4, the discussion on this target that reads as ensuring active management actions to enable recovery as well as conservation of species and the genetic diversity of all wild and domesticated species, including through in situ and ex situ conservation. So the addition is to add the word in situ conservation, on-farm conservation, and effectively manage human wildlife interactions to avoid or reduce human wildlife conflict. As those of you who were in Geneva, you would have recognized that we did have some discussion on this particular target and the language as well. Target 5, looking at the issue of trade, requires, or the reflection document indicates that the target would read as eliminate unsustainable, illegal and unsafe harvesting, trade and use of wild species. Target 6 is not just looking at managing the pathways of introductions of invasive alien species and the related, but also to identify such pathways so that appropriate management actions could be taken. Target 7 that focuses on the issue of pollution, where the suggestion for Nairobi will be to look at all sources of pollution, all sources to levels that are not harmful to biodiversity and ecosystem functioning, including by reducing the nutrients element of it. Nutrients that are lost to the environment by at least half, and pesticides by at least 2/3, and eliminating the discharge of plastic waste. So of course, the distinction there that the discussions happened in Geneva was to look at the element of nutrients, the element of pesticides, but also to focus on all the sources of pollution as a part of understanding and dealing with this particular target. Target 8 that looked at the minimizing the impact of climate change. I saw a question already in the chat box on the links between the discussions and climate change. This target looks at minimizing the impact of climate change on biodiversity, contributing to both mitigation and adaptation using ecosystem-based approaches. So that was something which was added. And there is also a numerical value in this target where it says contributing to at least 10 gigatons of carbon dioxide per year to global mitigation efforts, and also to avoid the negative impacts on biodiversity. Target 9 looks at ensuring sustainable use of species, where there are still some discussions that are ongoing in terms of to use the words including fisheries, thereby providing benefits, including nutrition, food security, medicines, and livelihoods, and to all people, especially in the most vulnerable areas, while safeguarding the sustainable customary use by indigenous people and local communities. So the discussions on Target 9 will focus on some of those elements that are highlighted as well. Target 10 looks at ensuring all areas under agriculture, aquaculture, and forestry are managed sustainably, in particularly through conservation and sustainable use, but also most importantly that there is an intent by the parties to include the terms contributing to both ecological intensification as well as ecological resilience of these production systems. Target 11, the additionality is to focus on the ecosystem services, not just on regulating the quality of air and quality of water and quantity of water and those related to protection from hazardous waste, but also to discuss this in the context of ecosystem services. Target 12 looks at increasing the area of access to and benefits from green and blue spaces for human health, well-being in urban areas and other densely populated areas. So this particular target directly reads to biodiversity in the urban spaces and urban landscapes. Target 13 looks at implementation of issues related to the access to genetic resources and fair and equitable sharing of benefits. But the discussion that is expected in Nairobi, emanating from the discussions in Geneva, is to focus on the scope of this target. Is it in the context of the Nagoya Protocol, or is it in the overall context of the convention? Because Article 15 of the convention is related to issues of access and benefit sharing. The issues of inclusion of DSI links to the discussions that are already ongoing in areas beyond national jurisdiction or biodiversity beyond national jurisdiction under the UN UNCLOS, and also to link to additional targets that actually have been discussed. Target 14 looks at integrating biodiversity, but also its multiple values, not just biodiversity, but also its multiple values into policies, programs, regulations, planning, and development processes, including focusing on poverty reduction strategies, national accounting, and the assessment of environmental impacts at all levels of the government across all sectors of economy, and ensuring all activities and the financial flows, which is an additional element that was actually an outcome of the discussion in Geneva, focusing on alignment of all of this with the goals of the global biodiversity framework. Target 15, the focus would be on looking at private sector, that all businesses, public, private, large, medium, and small. And of course, there were some comments we heard in Geneva on whether to have the small and medium enterprises included or they should not be included as a part of this discussion on the target, to assess and report on their dependence and impact on biodiversity at different levels, local to global, and also to ensure that they progressively reduce their negative impacts on biodiversity conservation, at the same time contributing to positive impacts, so that the biodiversity related risks to businesses, and there is a movement from private sector and businesses to sustainably looking at extraction production practices, sourcing and supply chains, and also safe use as well as disposal. Target 16 focuses on.
I'm really sorry to interrupt. I'm just conscious of time, and and we are receiving many questions. So if you could kindly maybe speed up and
Sure.
wrap up.
Yeah. Target 16
Thank you.
focuses on the people that are encouraged to adopt sustainable consumption practices. 17, the focus of this target is related to biosafety and the Cartagena Protocol, where the discussion is again in the context of the scope of this particular target, whether Cartagena Protocol or the convention, and also the roles or the role of benefits of using this technology. Target 18, as you know, is very important in terms of the financing elements of it, where it looks at reducing the negative perverse incentives in terms of the numbers that are provided there. But the question is, are we targeting it to do it by 2030? And also the reverse, the targets 18 and 19 by repurposing additional finances, which is related to target 19, that looks at having additional financial resources for realizing and implementing the global biodiversity framework. But there are also interest to include the non-monetary benefits, use of percentage versus absolute numbers in terms of the targets that are presented there, and the role of new funding. Target 20 looks at having relevant knowledge, including traditional knowledge, which is more related to the Article 8G of the convention and the related processes, where the focus of the discussions would also be on access to information, knowledge and usefulness of the information. Target 21 looks at equitably having gender sensitive plans, as well as participation in decision making related to biodiversity by indigenous people, local communities, including on issues or rights over the lands, territories and resources, as well as by women, girls and youth representatives. So essentially, these are some of the key targets that are going to be a part of the discussion in Nairobi. And of course, the presentation will be shared with you, where there are some more elements related to the sections that will be a part of the discussion in Nairobi that you can read when you have time. So certainly I'll sort of stop there, and looking forward to seeing many of you or all of you in Nairobi fairly soon. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bala, and really apologize for interference. But yeah, certainly we will share the slides so everybody could see in detail about your presentation. And so now I would like to invite our last speaker, Ms. Daniela Guaras, Senior Technical Specialist from UNEP WCMC, to provide additional updates on other issues related to the framework, such as financial mechanism and the monitoring framework. Daniela, over to you.
Hello, everyone. Good morning. Thank you so much for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here with you today. And thank you so much also to the co-chair, the secretariat, for sharing those very informative presentations about what happened in Geneva and what is coming up, and also Bala for sharing those views on the targets and goals. So I will be very brief because a lot has been said already. So I do not have slides. So what I thought might be nice to actually identify a few of the points that have been raised already, and try to bring things together in preparation for what's coming up. And one of the key elements that we all know, and Francis and Jyoti mentioned clearly, is this understanding of the post-2020 global biodiversity framework to be understood as a whole or as a package. And that's actually a very important message that has been coming through since the start of the process, as you all know. And the intention here is to bring up some of those other elements or dimensions beyond the goals and targets that actually will need to be decided by COP15 for adoption at the second part of the COP. A key element on that process is, as was also mentioned, the importance of the mandate that the subsidiary bodies had to contribute to the development of the framework in different areas that relate to their mandates. And that's very linked to the very intensive intersessional work that is underway at the moment, and that will continue. on different areas like resource mobilization, as was mentioned, the further development of the monitoring framework, digital sequence information, monitoring, planning, monitoring, reporting, and review. So it's now the interesting addition of this fourth meeting of the open-ended working group actually brings that opportunity of really builds on the progress that has been made in Geneva, considering also the outcomes of, for example, the workshop that will take place to further develop some of the annexes of the SBI recommendation on monitoring, planning, monitoring, reporting, and review that will go to the COP. And then for parties to have a better idea of what that package that they will consider during the COP will look like. So in terms of the different sort of components, but also something that was heard, I think, quite heavily during the Geneva meetings and throughout the online sessions as well, relates to this idea of ambition and what ambition actually means and what components or elements of the framework as a whole should reflect certain type of ambition or key elements that are very important to parties. And that will be definitely an area in which further discussion will be needed, and obviously it's hopefully the views are coming together on that, because at the moment there are different ways to understand ambition. So in terms of the goals, the targets, which goals, which targets have a more details than others, so that within the framework itself, but also in relation to the enabling conditions, means of implementation, how other elements or instruments that are to be considered by COP, like the long-term strategic approach for capacity building, the plan of action for gender, and so on, how all these pieces fit together, and what is actually the level of ambition in each, and how each of them will support each other to actually support all of you, all the parties, to implement the framework and achieve the outcomes that are needed by 2050. And then another question, so something that obviously, I mean, it's impossible to cover every single topic in detail, but if we take a few as an example, and for example, picking up on the enhancement of the responsibility and transparency, and what work has been carried out by SBI on this, that will be continued, as I said, during the workshop in Nairobi prior to the open-ended working group. It's okay, what are the key structures and mechanisms that you need as parties to start implementing straight away, but also to enhance implementation and achieve better outcomes than the world achieved in terms of the strategic plan by 2020. So what are those bonds that are needed to be adopted at the second part of COP15? And then what are the further details that you could be developing further by the following COP, let's say, well, COP16 in this case. So those are some of the key areas. Then another important element that I wanted to highlight is something that Jyoti mentioned in terms of what is that we are trying to do different, or that you are trying to do different this time. And that, of course, covers the development of the monitoring framework and trying to adopt a monitoring framework at the same time as the post-2020 framework is adopted, so that actually there is clarity in terms of how you will monitor progress, what indicators are to be used by national through the national reports, and so on. So again, some of these things are at the moment taking place in intersessional work, and there will be an expert workshop focusing on that in Bonn after the open-ended working group. So I won't add much more than that. I will add a few of these resources that might be helpful to try for you when preparing for the meetings, including the reports of the Bern 2 consultations with other biodiversity-related conventions and other MEAs, given that some questions in the chat refer to how we are bringing together, for example, biodiversity and climate change in the discussions. So thank you so much. And yeah, if you have any questions, happy to contribute. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you very much, Daniela, for your intervention and comments, and really adding your additional perspectives and reminding us of other key issues that we need to be aware of for the negotiations on the framework. So having heard 4 presentations, now we'd like to quickly move to the Q&A session. We've been receiving many questions. So at this point, I'd like to hand over to Han to moderate the Q&A and the remaining part of the meeting. Han, over to you.
Thanks, Makiko. And thanks to all the presenters, very valuable updates. So indeed, there have been quite a few questions. I think due to the constraint of time, we will go with 3 questions, and I hope that's okay for now. So there are 2 questions to Francis. I think is very interesting and very relevant. The first one, first one's from Li Shuo. So the question is, what modalities and the methodologies are we using in Nairobi that are different from Geneva? And if there is not much difference, are you confident that Nairobi will achieve a different and a better outcome, as you mentioned, the clean text? So this is the first question to Francis. And I think I'll just throw in the second question as well. So this second question is from Wu Chong, also to Francis. The question is, how does the issue of synergy between biodiversity and climate change addressed in the negotiations? And can I invite Francis maybe to first respond to these 2 questions?
I hope you can hear me. I think for us,
Yes.
the first question is, what modalities are we using in Nairobi? How is it different from Geneva? I think we cannot say that we are coming up with a completely different modality here. What is important, we have communicated, is that we are requesting parties to come when they are prepared to actually compromise, because this is a party-led process. And as co-chairs, you cannot dictate to parties a law, or, on anything. You guide them, but the way they approach it or the way they start discussing it, can be at their discretion. So we shall try our best to encourage parties to compromise. Secondly, would like, when they go in the contact groups, that where the text is very huge, first, we should begin narrowing down the text so that we can move with the discussion, because you can't discuss a text which is a half a page. What will you be saying there? And maybe thirdly, we've said again that there's a co-chair's reflection. If you look at those co-chairs' reflection, the texts were a lot shorter. Could that be another option that parties would wish to explore? So we can only give these options or guidance to parties, but then we see how they take it on board. So that is the limitation we have as co-chairs. But Jyoti can add a few other as well. Then, or Vinod is also around. Then how does the issue of the climate change, how we are tackling it in biodiversity. Specifically, this will come, of course, under target 8. That is where we are trying to bring that link between climate change and biodiversity, a contribution of biodiversity by mission. So there's a specific target that covers that. And I think already we see what came up from Geneva on that. So the framework has that in place. Maybe my colleagues could have something else to add, because I see time may not be on our side, but to give the floor to either Binod or Jyoti to add something. Binod about the approach. And then the other one also was about trying to reduce the workload on the contact group. You see, you would have the Binods discussing, first of all, the goals, then going into those sections A to D or whatever. But we've said this time, let the Binods only look at goals. Let the contact groups only look at targets, and let this other be considered separately. So those are some of the ways we are trying to see if it could help us move a bit faster. But Jyoti and Binod may have additional.
Thanks, Francis, so much. Now I'd like to just check whether Jyoti and Vinod, you'd like to add anything for these questions.
Nothing from my side. I think Francis covered it well. Vinod, please.
Well, thank you very much. See, there are wishes and there are hopes, and we are living by them. And we hope that parties will come forward. Our informal discussions are leading that everybody wants to move ahead. And if that is the spirit, then everybody has to adjust. Everybody has to have a little trade-off. I cannot disclose everything what we are trying, but a lot of strategic thinking and hard work has gone in, and we are reaching out to all our co-leads so that we present a unified picture on how different elements of the framework are going to be tackled. And we are hopeful that with the support of parties, we will get ahead, and we will try to reduce or remove as many brackets as possible and have a consensus so that the Nairobi meeting builds upon what we were able to achieve in Geneva. So that's in brief, but let's keep our hope alive and let's keep everybody's cooperation into it. Thank you.
And then the other thing is also not, if you recall earlier, we said we wouldn't like parties to add text to what was already discussed. You know, that what was already discussed, fully discussed in Geneva. We wouldn't want additional text there, so that you focus on what you already came up with. That could help us also.
Thanks so much. There is also one question dedicated to Jyoti. So this is specifically about the modality for party and NGO access in Nairobi. So they heard that there might be a ticket system for each constituency group, meaning only a handful of NGO representatives in the room at any given time. So they just wanted to check whether that's true. Over to you, Jyoti, maybe you could provide some clarity.
Thank you so much. And thank you for the question. As you know, with COVID, this is a daily changing issue. We don't know what will actually happen by the time we arrive in Nairobi. But for the moment, what we do know is that we have that because it's open air, we are not making any. There will be no restrictions for access to the venue as long as you do your COVID tests and all of that and are negative, and it's exactly the same setup that we had in Geneva. So there's no restrictions to access to venue. There is a restriction to the plenary hall because it's not that big. It's 600 people and we have to keep social distancing. So we will be giving a ticket per 2 tickets per party and 1 to IGOs and NGOs and other stakeholders. But if the security feel that the room is full, because as you know, I just said we have a lot of registered, we have 250 registered so far, NGOs and stakeholders. So if I think it is going to be on a first come, first basis for NGOs and CSOs and other stakeholders. And if security feels that the room is full, we have a capacity of 300. I think the full room has a capacity of 600, but we have a capacity of 300 or something, or 400 in the room. So it has to unfortunately be limited. However, there is an overflow room, and this time there are no restrictions whatsoever to the overflow room. So that should not be a problem to follow the negotiations. And then of course everyone can swap in and out as they wish, as was done in Geneva. Thank you. I hope that it's just difficult COVID times. Thank you. We're trying our best to get as many people in as possible. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Jyoti. And with the time constraints, I'm going to close the Q&A session. And I see some panelists like Daniela is already responding to the question in the chat box. So let's close this Q&A for now, and let's now enter session 2 for today, to have a dialogue panel on key areas of focus on member states in Asia and follow up. I'd like to invite Mr. Vinod Mathur, who is a co-lead of the contact group for post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework, the chairperson of India's National Biodiversity Authority, and Mr. Bala Pisupadi from Law Division of UNEP to facilitate this session. So over to you, Vinod and Bala.
Thank you so much. Can you see my slide and can you hear me?
Yes, very clear.
Okay, so see, a lot has been said this morning by the co-chair of the open-ended group and followed by Jyoti and Bala. If you look at the title here, I was given to understand that this particular meeting is to look at what the Asian countries are doing. And I want to bring in first the perspective on the framework from South Asia. And you would see here that very early on this year, in the first week of January itself, we organized a consultation. And at that point of time, we had 2 things in mind, that the South Asian countries would like to have a common perspective, because we are bound by geography and we are bound by similar ecological pressures and biodiversity issues. And then there was a very important element of OECMs being talked about. And fortunately, many countries in South Asia are part of the 30 by 30 initiative, where we feel that OECMs have an important role to play. And India has joined the 30 by 30 initiative, and we wanted other countries in the region to follow suit. And that's why we call this consultation. And very interestingly, all 7 countries in South Asia, from Bangladesh, Bhutan, India, Maldives, Nepal, Pakistan, Sri Lanka joined this. And we were then able to work through that what is their stand as far as the GBF is concerned. Because lots of discussions were going on. And at that point of time, there were no face-to-face consultations after we met in Rome. And to my very happiness, I would say all countries said that they need to build synergies and build on upon the ambition as is being envisaged in the GBF. But since the countries in the region have mountains, forests, rivers, coast, and marine, they wanted that there should be an integrated approach so that all ecosystems and all bioregions get conserved. And interestingly, while all 4 goals of GBF are important, there was a very strong emphasis that goal D, which pertains to financial resource mobilization, must be given more emphasis. I won't go into the details, but there were some very specific suggestions on each of the goals. I am talking of a situation before we met in Geneva. Countries were present, South Asian countries were present over there. They made their interventions. There was a strong feeling that connectivity issues have to be given a very strong weightage. And we in this part of the world, we have a huge issue with the human wildlife conflict. So targets which deal with them should be appropriately integrated on that. But overall, I would say that there is a strong political commitment that we need to move forward. We need to get away from the, if mistakes, if I can say so, in not able to achieve the IG target in the new GBF. And that is where everybody is looking forward of what happens and in what form the global biodiversity framework takes place. There is, of course, a very important point regarding implementation and regarding financial resource mobilization. And I'm very sure that both the Secretariat and the co-chairs and the co-leads know that there is, while there is a definite need for having an ambitious GBF, it has to be matched by an equally ambitious implementation, read financial mobilization plans. So this was in very brief about the views of the South Asian countries which are there. And already I responded to this question that how are we trying to face up what happens in Nairobi? So obviously we had some own experience, some good, bad, and mixed in Geneva. We need to learn from them. We are learning from them, and we are hopeful that the time that we will spend in Nairobi will be a more productive time, and we would be able to build upon the gains that we made and whatever unfinished agenda was there. Francis has already explained some of the expectations from the parties. We as co-leads are working together. We want to present a more homogeneous picture because see, I as a co-lead of goals, whatever we discuss in goals has a bearing on other contact groups. So we want to establish a better synergy and harmonization. And that is where we are working with the other co-leads. And we are hopeful that we should be able to move strategically in Nairobi so that every minute, every hour, every penny spent in Nairobi is very, very productive. So as I said, we all live with hopes and so are our hopes. But these hopes are backed up by very strong action on the part of all the co-leads. So we now have a team, as everybody knows, the 8 co-leads are there, 2 more are to be added. Then we have a wonderful secretariat led by Jyoti and all our other staff members. And very, very frequently we have inputs from both Francis and Brazil. So we intend to present a much unified picture. There are some issues, particularly I will be very candid to say that how to deal with milestone is an issue, but we will definitely be presenting an approach and we would understand and hope that parties would follow them. So I will stop here. If there are a quick question, I will respond. I also have another meeting with UNEP coming up. So I will then try to take excuse, but I'm here for a few more minutes. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Vinod. As you said, the hopes and actions are super important indeed for the successful meetings going forward. Now I'd like to check whether my colleague Bala would like to come in for the session 2, the dialogue panel. Over to you, Bala.
Thank you. Quite useful inputs. But of course, a little more time would have helped to have more questions and some interaction, because technically this is the only time countries are together as a region. So certainly that would have helped. But having said that, the aspirations of the Secretariat, UNEP, or the co-leads or the co-chairs are to an extent can only be guided and strengthened by how prepared parties are going to be coming to Nairobi. You know, we can have our plans, we can have our strategies on how to conduct the meeting, but the technicalities of how do we proceed to finalize the global biodiversity framework is entirely in the hands of the parties who will be present in Nairobi. And that is why the national preparations are so very important, so that the time that we have in Nairobi can be productively spent. So other than that, I don't have much of more comments at this time. Thank you.
Thanks, Bala. Now I think we are approaching the end, but I kind of wanted to try to see whether in the room, if there's any participants from the region would like to share any intervention before I invite Mr. Leoning to provide the closing remarks. I see no hands up. So, okay, and now we are moving to the final session, and thanks very much again to Vinod and Bala for the discussions and for sharing the perspective from the region. Now I'd like to invite Mr. Leoning, who is the Deputy Representative of President and the negotiator for CBD COP15, China's Ministry of Ecology and the Environment. Over to you, Mr. Liu, to provide a closing remark. I can't hear you. I'm not sure whether that's just me or other colleagues.
We cannot hear.
No, there is no sound.
Yeah, it's probably the speaker issue.
Okay.
Yes.
Can you hear me?
Yes,
Okay. Okay. Thank you, Han Meng. Dear Dr. De Chen, ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon and good morning. I would like to thank the Asia Pacific Office of the United Nations Environmental Program and Secretariat for organizing this regional briefing meeting and inviting me to attend this dialogue. At this meeting, Francis, Georgie, Bala, and other participants briefed the progress of the negotiations on the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework and the outcome of the Geneva Conference. Some participants also expressed their views on this progress and outcomes, which helped us further consolidate consensus and recognize the gaps, make preparations for WG 2024 to be held in Kenya, Nairobi. I would like to express my appreciation and gratitude to your work and hope that this meeting will contribute to the success of Nairobi meeting. Nairobi meeting is an important negotiation opportunity for the GBF before the second phase of COP15. There is not so much time left for the negotiation. We still have a lot of work to be done. It is believed that during the Nairobi meeting, all parties would reduce the repetition of their position, so the
Seems Mr. Liu is frozen. Maybe let's give him a moment, and hopefully it could be he could.
Yes,
yes,
it's okay.
Yes. Now you're back.
I don't know where I lost it, then I try to be back. Nairobi meeting is an important negotiation opportunity for the GBF before the second phase of COP15. There is not so much time left for negotiations. We still have a lot of work to be done. It is believed that during the Nairobi meeting, all parties would reduce the repetition of their positions, so the greatness, sincerity, be conscious and comprehensive, go straight to the points, draw the bottom line as soon as possible for the issues that have not been fully negotiated in GBF, find a landing ground and a stream to reach the other side of the rivers in the shortest time. I have 3 recommendations for the Nairobi meeting. First, I would like to encourage all parties to strengthen coordination during Nairobi, fully demonstrate flexibility, seek solutions to key issues, and send an optimistic and positive signal to the outside world. Second, I would like recommend to take advantage of in-person meeting to carry out small-scale consultations and find solutions for key issues such as DSI and resource mobilization. Thirdly, I would encourage Francis Basile and the Bureau member of Asian Pacific to show their strong leadership in order to reach a clean text for GBF as much as possible. We are willing to work with other parties and stakeholders to contribute to the success of the second phase of COP15. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Mr. Liu, for the very encouraging closing remark, and thanks so much for the 3 recommendations. So again, I think with that, I'd like to close today's session, and thanks very much to Chen again, and to Mr. Liu again for the opening and the closing remarks. And many thanks to all the presenters for your and the facilitators for all your valuable updates, inputs, and help to make today happen. So we certainly had a very fruitful session today. I think many of you would agree. At UNEP and working very closely with the CBD Secretariat and other partners, we will continue our commitment to support member states and towards the successful finalization and adaptation of the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework, as well as its effective implementation in the future. So to all the participants, you would note my colleague Mary Young, who have just shared the survey form in the chat box. And we will circulate that via email too. So do please help us to fill in the survey form, because this will help us to design the future events and to better support your needs. So all the presentation materials after this meeting, we will also make them available after today. So with that, again, thanks to all, and we'd like to close today's session. Thanks and goodbye for now.